Clinical trials aren't just for drug companies. They save lives, bring tomorrow's treatments to patients today, and offer help and hope when options run out. Dr. Elkhanany clears the myths, and there are so many, about clinical trials, and shows how access to those trials can change everything. When you subscribe to our show, you help us grow. Someone you know may need to hear this story, so please share with your family and friends and consider supporting our mission at therose.org. Let's talk about your breast. A different kind of podcast presented to you by The Rose, a breast center of excellence and a Texas treasure. You're going to hear frank discussions about tough topics, and you're going to learn why knowing about your breast could save your life. So, doctor, another big part of your time as a physician being in breast cancer, being a breast oncologist, has to do with clinical trials.
Correct.
So tell us exactly what a clinical trial is.
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, in its core, clinical trials are ways to determine how active a medicine, a drug, is to fight a specific disease or a specific indication. Now, clinical trials encompass so many different things. There are what we call phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and there's what's called preclinical evaluation, which are things that we do, all the things that we do before a drug reaches the level where it can be used for a clinical disease in humans. And then you have a clinical trial, you have phase 4, which is essentially after the drug is approved. So all of these are clinical trials, and the goal is to see how active a specific drug is.
Let's step back even one more. Why do we need clinical trials?
In a nutshell, every medicine that an individual is using for their health has been in a clinical trial. And think of clinical trials, really think of it as that test that you have to pass as a drug in order to be out there in the pharmacy. So any medicine that you close your eyes and pick out will be have been validated in a clinical trial.
So that's a good word. It's validated. It has proof behind it that it actually works.
Correct. And to be frank, most of the medicines would have some sort of activity. Mm-hmm. We never reach the clinical trial stage without having some sort of an activity. But the clinical trials help to put that activity into context. How big of an activity is it? And also, what about side effects? How can we weigh side effects to benefit? We have to have more benefit than side effects, otherwise it's not worth it. And this is why clinical trials, when they start, actually, so phase 1 is, think of it as the drug that we just started really to understand its side effects. That's really what phase 1 is all about. Side effects, what is the best dose? Do we need that high of a dose? Should we go down a little bit? And then once we feel comfortable about the dose and people are doing fine, we go to phase 2, which looks mostly at the efficacy of the drug. And a lot of the drugs in phase 2 tend to show some sort of activity. That means that they are working. Mm-hmm. But then comes phase 3, and phase 3 really asks a very simple question. Is it working better than what we have right now? You know, and that's what phase 3 is. So almost always phase 3 trials tend to compare two things. What we're doing right now, which, by the way, was yesterday's clinical trial, right? Mm-hmm. So what are we doing right now, the standard versus the new treatment, the new modality. And once the test passes that point, gets the seal of approval, gets that to be in the market.
So why is there a problem getting people to go into clinical trials?
I think there is a huge misunderstanding about many of the aspects of clinical trials. And I understand why this exists. Historically, unfortunately, there has been multiple situations in which clinical trials were performed without certain consents and certain approvals from participants, and that left a very sore spot.
Talk about cellular memory. I mean, it really could go back to that in so many different ways.
Yeah, and it's not just one or two. There are a multitude, unfortunately, of examples through different parts of clinical trials. And obviously, one of the famous ones was the Tuskegee experiment. And I got to be very familiar with it because I practiced in Alabama for 3 years before moving here. And just really saying the word clinical trial immediately elicits negative reactions from patients, again, understandably so. However, it is 50 plus, actually I would say more close to almost 60 years now, and the world has changed. And today's care has nothing to do with what we used to do, not just 6 years, rather 20 years ago. And within that spectrum, there is now significant component of patient autonomy and patient understanding and patient education when it comes with what are clinical trials, what are we hoping to achieve, what are your rights within a clinical trial.
So how do you get past that? I mean, I've heard this so many times. They're just experimenting on me. It's just to make money for the drug companies. I'm not going to get anything out of it. So help us understand, first, how do you combat that without education? You almost cannot. True?
You cannot. You cannot. And so the first thing that we do, first thing that I do, is really reach out to patients in their community. So many times, whenever I do any of the outreach activities, I would dedicate some time to discuss clinical trials. Why do we do clinical trials? To move the needle forward. If we continue to do the standard of care, we will not move at all. We will just do it over and over and over. So the only way to move beyond the standard is to prove that something comes in better than the standard. Now, the caveat is, how do we know it is better? Well, we don't know. But we tend to try to guesstimate before we actually take it further, meaning that at every step of the way, as we're gaining more and more understanding of these new drugs, our confidence that it is going to work gets higher and higher. And by the time a drug reaches the stage, phase 3, we have a fairly good confidence that it will outperform the standard of care. But the phase 3 is about the magnitude of benefit. How high are we talking about versus side effects? So again, discuss.
Is that really measurable? I mean, if it's a percentage better, is that worth it?
Well,
who makes that decision?
That is a very important question. It is not that. Now that one is tough to answer because who makes that decision tends to be, ultimately might be the patient. So I can tell you what a medicine can do in patients who have like a bad disease, bad cancers, like a pancreatic cancer, or GI cancers, or even like a bad stage 4 breast cancer. Maybe the medicine can push the needle a couple of more months, maybe even a year, with good quality of life. It's worth it, When you talk about some cancers that tend to be very mild, indolent, and they're not as aggressive as some of the other cancers, occasionally the benefit might not be as much at the risk of side effects. But it tends to be a very calculated measure. Interestingly, in the United States, right, we don't significantly pay attention to cost versus perceived benefit, because a lot of these drugs tend to be, once the once there is some proven benefit, the FDA would do cost analysis, but the majority of drugs pass that preliminary cost analysis and gets approved when they have efficacy. That is not the case in Europe, for example. Right? So they will take a medicine, they will do a very thorough cost analysis, and remember, this is a system in which everybody who is eligible to get a drug will get the drug. There's universal coverage, so the government will be paying the pill. So the government will sit and say, how effective is this drug versus how much money are we going to pay for it? And how much moving the needle is it actually going to move? You actually don't get every drug that gets approved in the United States does not necessarily get approved in Europe because of that reason.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
that's kind of backwards of what a lot of people think. Oh, Europe, they just move the drugs right on, and
no, that is not the case. There is a lot of medicines that have approval in the United States, not necessarily worldwide because of this. But touching back to patient education, so this is really why the clinical trials are important. They move the needle forward. Now, how do the drug companies play a part in all that? Well, it is not a secret that at the end of the day, drug companies want their medicines to work because they will get reimbursement out of it. They will get money back. However, in order for them to prove that, they put a ton more money. Doing clinical trials, doing research and drug development is incredibly costly. It is estimated that a certain drug can cost, in the current day and age, somewhere between $1 up to $3 billion in cost and production. The clinical trials are international. To phase 3, in order to try a drug in thousands of patients, you will need billions of dollars for this clinical trial to be implemented widely. And this cost obviously goes into the synthesis of the drug, all the clinical care that gets done for all the thousands of patients that typically is all billed directly to the drug company, all the side effects, the hospital sometimes stays that had to do with the drugs, all the teams that are being taking care of the patient at the levels of the institution. So a typical clinical trial would be in about 400 or 500, phase 3, 400 or 500 sites across the entire world, aiming to accrue, getting maybe somewhere between 1,000 to almost 10,000 patients sometimes, and tend to follow up patients for years and years and years to detect that signal of success. So all of these are money that adds up. So with that being said, that is a very big decision. So if you think about it, a lot of the drug companies will not proceed with all that money except if they have a very clear signal that drug is working. They call it the go or no-go signal, usually towards the end of the phase 2. So they see the activity in phase 2, the drug is working pretty good, and they say, okay, do we need to go that route or not? And again, in a way, it is true that the drug companies are the ones that sponsor the drug, in most of these large phase 3 trials. But in the same venue, if you think about the new medicines as new products, think of, it's a simple example, but think of your TV. Each year you get better TVs. Well, they are putting the research and development into TVs. You don't know about that, but you know that they do. And you don't know what kind of technology are they reaching out, every year, but you know that the TV quality is getting better. The picture is getting bigger because there's always a demand for better TVs. I know it's a simple analogy, but if you think about it, that is the way also a lot of the drug development works. You refine the process, get a nicer drug, more active, less toxic, zoom out, expand it to patients, and take it from there.
So for the patient who is in a clinical trial, they might benefit from extended life, a better quality of life, like you said, if it's not as toxic. Mm-hmm. What else would they benefit from while they're in that trial?
So,
those are important things.
These are
absolutely.
2 important things.
Yeah. I just don't know how you could convince someone to go through a clinical trial that may or may not work. And they're already fighting for their life. So take me through. I'm that person. What are you saying to me?
So the conversation might change slightly about what type of clinical trials that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Let me explain. Phase 1 clinical trials, these are typically the ones in which the medicine might or might not work. Meaning, with these early phase trials, phase 1 is called early phase. We usually look for patients who might be having multiple lines of therapy already, unfortunately, stage 4, did this drug, that drug, ran through all the typical types of care that we know of. And then they come to me and they're like, what next? What am I going to do next? Well, we got to think outside the box. And when I say that, I mean we got to see some of the medicines that are new, novel, and work in a different way. And really, because the standard stuff that we've tried are not working anymore. So that's your phase 1. And phase 1 are usually given again in patients who have had all the classical treatments. So there's really nothing more necessarily in the realm of the classic treatments to work.
Right.
Sometimes they might not work. Other times they might work so well that, in fact, the drugs get into this what's called breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and within a matter of maybe 1 or 2 years, it becomes the new standard of care. And a classic example with that was immunotherapy. So immunotherapy started off as this new class of drugs that no one really knew even, what to expect out of them. We know how they work. And by the way, one of the major contributors to immunotherapy was, the immunology team at MD Anderson. Mm-hmm. And the idea was we'll just make the immune system fight infections, and the immune system that fights infection will make it fight cancer, and we'll just monitor things and see how it works. And to everyone's surprise and incredible delight, it worked so well that the drug went from phase 1s into phase 2s, got all of these breakthrough therapies across multiple cancers, and then got into accelerated approvals, which mean that the FDA said, oh my gosh, this has worked so well. We're just going to give you an approval out of phase 2 until you guys have a phase 3. That way we get this very active drug to patients much earlier because there was really nothing else out there.
Right.
But that's the story on phase 1. We don't get a lot of these drastic success stories, but we do have every now and then a really good success story that comes in. Now, another one has to do with the novel ADCs, or antibody drug conjugates, that are now, again, revolutionizing how we give chemotherapy to patients. So antibody drug conjugates are these little tiny targeted Uber drivers, if you will, that have a chemotherapy in the back, and then they drive to where the cancer is, and they ditch the chemotherapy right then and there. And then depending on how you design the driver, if you will, of that chemo, you get to drive the chemo to different parts of the body. So that's basically...
Instead of all over.
Exactly. So that's different cancers, right? So regardless of where the cancer is at, the molecule carrying the chemotherapy will go right there and destroy it. Again, phase 1 was enormously successful. Tremendous success in phase 1. The drug actually had activity in almost 90% of the patients.
Oh, my goodness.
And so went to phase 2, phase 3. So with phase 1, that's really the conversation. Phase 2 and phase 3 are more of the bigger trials that we know we already had a pretty good signal that we know that the drug works. And by works here, I mean that it will decrease the cancer, impact the cancer in some way, delay the cancer from coming back. And it's just that we don't know how much of a benefit that will be. Is it a 1%, as you mentioned? Is it going to be a 10%, 50%? Hard to tell. So that's why we do it. Right? Always when I talk with my patient, I explain to them, where you are right now, the standard of care, it's good. However, we can do better. We can do a little better. And this is the educated development process of clinical trials. Here's why we think we can do better. In my experience, once you take the time and discuss with patients what clinical trials are and what their right is on clinical trial, including the right to say, to exit the trial at any given time. This is not like a contract. Once they understand that, people really love it, and they would say, why would anybody get a standard of care, which is like yesterday's treatment, if you have new treatments for today?
Mm-hmm. But there's lots of people that don't have a doctor that will talk with them.
Well, I think that this is part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. I think that the actual process of discussing clinical trials and offering them, one, it is fairly intensive, time-consuming process. Mm-hmm. And two, it also requires cultural competency as well as scientific literacy about what are we offering to the patients. It is not an easy task. However, it is part of, I would say, what makes medicine and what makes cancer care really valuable, that we can offer these drugs to our patients. And it is part of, it should be part of our treatment. In fact, if you look at the NCCN guidelines, which is everybody followed the guidelines, right? Mm-hmm. They will have this universal, general recommendation that if you do have a clinical trial in this setting, we will prefer that to the guidelines. And we find that actually listed in every single page.
Really?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So again, because that's what they are trying to offer.
To do, right.
Because if they didn't say that, then somebody might say, well, why do I do a clinical trial if I have the guidelines? The guidelines are yesterday's clinical trials.
Oh, that's so true. And what if that doctor decides you're just not a good candidate for whatever reason? And makes that decision without ever talking to you? I mean, will we ever find a time when every doctor is required to do that with quality, grace?
I wish that's the case. So I think I will talk not about what used to be the case, but what I anticipate will be the case.
Oh, that'd be good.
We are in an era in which healthcare is transforming by the day. And we have now patients who ask more questions, more intelligent questions, more insightful questions that pertain to their right, understanding what they have, and being an active participant in their disease. And I think that this is really the future direction, which is the patients are now expected in a way to participate in their care. Mm-hmm. So in my practice, I am a very firm believer in shared decision-making. I do shared decision-making, which actually, a lot of patients love, but some patients don't like. Some patients come and tell me, Doc, don't tell me what we think we should be doing. You tell me what you want me to do.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
But the majority, I would argue, would want to play a part. As you know, cancer takes that personal liberty and that ability to choose from you, and putting that shared decision-making back into the conversation helps balance this out a little bit. But going back to that point, how does that factor in clinical trials? We see many patients come now to their appointments who have already researched their disease and even looked through some sort of apps or search through the website about clinical trial that they might be eligible to, which I think that is fantastic. And if they don't, I tell them actually how to do it. I tell them this is how you want to look for clinical trials. Every new patient that comes to me in my clinic, I tell them 2 recommendations. Every single new patient. I tell them always try to seek a second opinion if you're able to, specifically for clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And the second recommendation I always give them is to reach out to their insurance company to look for their oncology liaison, because each insurance, each person's coverage will have like an oncology liaison that would be associated, with the patient's coverage. That's the one that typically will help them with all the scans, the imaging and stuff like that. These are my two comments. The first one, seeking a second opinion, is really mostly for clinical trials. If I'm in a place that have X amount of clinical trials, I always tell them, go get a second opinion. Also see what clinical trials do they have and if the care is going to be similar. And this is important because when I talk to also patients in the community and when I educate patients in the community, that becomes very, very important. It's not easy for everybody to get second opinions, but with the advent of video visits and telemedicine, it certainly did improve the accessibility, to an extent.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And there are a lot of virtual second opinions where they will review the imaging, they review the scans, and then they will comment on what patients, what they think from their expertise. I think that this is important in today's age because it's not just making sure that you're on the right track, because again, guidelines are the same really most of the time. The guidelines are what physicians follow, but it is the clinical trials and the availability of the next phase of treatment, the next new generation, if you will, of therapy to the patients.
It's not limited by your geography because of these tools that we have now.
Correct.
Yeah, that could make a really big difference.
But education is key. And understanding that being in control of your own disease and being your own advocate is a key point. Now, I'm fortunate that I work in a facility at Baylor College of Medicine, in which we have tremendous amounts of clinical trials. We're close to MD Anderson, who do have tremendous amount of clinical trials. We share patients, we send patients back and forth, specifically for clinical trials. However, there are patients in the community that do not have that privilege. Then one of the things that I have been extensively working on is how can we understand these specific limitations and is there a way to bridge them? So when I see a patient coming in from 2-3 hours away, I would, for example, tell them, hey, we have that clinical trial and let me work with the drug company and see if we can get you a voucher or gas, or a gas voucher, for example, or some sort of a bus voucher at the very least. Let me see if we can get some child care, reimbursement for you. And we have actually examples of certain settings, especially in the phase 1, in which we're able to have lodging for patients, hotel stays, in order to minimize that logistic burden on patients.
And that's so important because there's a lot of factors that could stop someone from participating that we don't have any real control over, or the patient doesn't. So knowing that there could be some assistance in some way could make all the difference in that decision.
Right. And there are programs that are specifically designed to support patients who are going to be enrolled in clinical trials. And that includes some of the stuff that I mentioned. But it goes all the way out to actually having some medicine, supportive websites, even including virtual pharmacists and virtual navigators. In fact, we have a program right now, using virtual navigators for one of the drugs that we have, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So that one of the pills that we use in HER2-positive breast cancer, in which patients can have access to a virtual pharmacist who can actually help them with their treatment and their concerns on that pill. And so there are all these tools that exist out there, and it's just the coordinating them for the right patients.
So you see a brighter future for breast cancer patients?
We definitely see a brighter future. Breast cancer mortality has decreased from the 1980s until now by about 43%. And interestingly, that is a huge part of that has to do with all the advancement in the endocrine therapy, the advancement in the anti-HER2 therapy, and the introduction of the immunotherapy, as well as most recently the antibody conjugates. And it seems like every decade or so, there is a huge revolution in the care of breast cancer in which that extends the mortality reduction and the survival of patients by a considerable amount of time. For example, when you look at how the anti-HER2 therapy was developed, or tamoxifen, which is our hormone receptor positive breast cancer patient, their development took some time. We're talking about, I think for tamoxifen, the whole process ranged in the order of about 15 to 20 years from, look at that, the cancer has hormone receptors on the surface of the cells, and they turned out to be estrogen receptors. The cancer is taking estrogen as a mechanism of survival. We can mimic estrogen by giving a scarred version, if you will, of estrogen to patients that don't sit where estrogen is sitting, but it's not going to work, for the cancer cell, and therefore the cancer cells die. That sounds like a great idea. Let's test it in mice. Let's test it in bigger mammals. Well, that drug appears to have significant activity. Let's bring it to humans. And that whole process, took about 20 years. And then by the late 1980s, tamoxifen was tested in one of the larger clinical trials, and it showed how, survival benefit.
Right, it changed.
Incredible. Immediately, day and night. A couple of years later, people were not dying of breast cancer. Anti-HER2 therapy, Herceptin, has some, the ember of all maladies, had a whole chapter about that. And I think it was fantastic to see how this drug saved patients from deathbed, literally.
It did. And I remember when that was a death sentence.
They were going in hospitals in UCLA and in other hospitals in Los Angeles and looking for patients with HER2-positive breast cancer who have liver failure or this. And they will give Herceptin to these patients, and it would reverse their disease course. It was magnificent.
Truly a miracle. And I'm so glad that you're seeing things getting better, not worse.
I think things are getting better. I think that we have more education, more access to health care now. There's definitely more that we're able to do, but on average, everything is slowly shifting up. Doesn't mean that we don't have work to do. It means that we actually have more work to do to bridge the equality gap and access to care.
And that may be our next phase in everything that we're doing in healthcare. Making sure everyone has quality health care, like you said.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming back and being with us today and giving us some real-life examples of clinical trials and the good that they do and how much it really has helped move that, like you said, needle, and has saved so many lives.
Well, thank you for having me, and I think that I will be amiss not to commend you on the incredible work that you have been doing, being a pillar in care pathways for these patients, being able to actually reach to the community, establish yourself as the liaison for the patients and for those who are concerned and maybe unable to or don't want to or don't have the education to do what they need to do for their health care, but actually pivot, continue to be a leader, continue to be a trusted source, and then developing pathways for their cure and for their health. I think that was incredibly challenging, but as I can say very clearly, incredibly rewarding journey in the same time. Thank you for everything that you do for the community and continue to do.
Oh, appreciate your kind words. Thank you, Doctor.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today on Let's Talk About Your Breasts. This podcast is produced by Speak Podcasting and brought to you by The Rose. Visit therose.org to learn more about our organization. Subscribe to our podcast, share episodes with friends, and join the conversation on social media using hashtag Let's Talk About Your Breasts. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. Consider supporting The Rose. Your gift can make the difference to a person in need. And remember, self-care is not selfish, it's essential.